The hardness in a padel racket is one of the most important aspects to consider. If you don't choose the right hardness for your racket, you won't feel comfortable and you could even get injured. But what's more, the hardness can change during the same match, so you have to keep this in mind. So do you wanna know what I think are the 7 best hard rackets of 2025? The last one is the hardest, but the 6th one is my favorite, so pay attention. Hello to all players, I'm Pablo and I welcome you to a new 4Set. If I ask you what is hardness in a padel racket, would you know how to answer quickly? Well, it's the rigidity or flexibility of its materials, mainly the rubber and the fibers. Hardness directly influences the feel when hitting the ball and the performance of the racket, which is why it's so important. A soft racket will have more flexible materials that in low intensity shots will help us generate more speed thanks to the ball output. But in high intensity shots, this works against you and won't transmit all the power we want to our shot. On the other hand, a hard racket will have more rigid materials that will be more faithful in transmitting the energy we give to the ball, so it won't have as much ball output. Neither a soft racket nor a hard racket is better, it depends on the player and what they're looking for. But today, if you're watching this video, I'm bringing you what I consider to be the best hard rackets of 2025. But first, how can you tell if a racket is hard? Well, if you can try it on the court, it will be very easy, but if you can't, well, in that case, you can tell by the sound when hitting with your hand, for example. Because a hard racket will tend to produce a sharper, metallic sound with less echo, while soft rackets usually have a deeper, drum-like sound. For example, this is a very hard racket from previous years, and this is a very soft racket. Notice the sound differences. Or as simple as trying to flex the faces of the racket with your hands, because with a hard racket you will feel that the faces are rigid and rarely give under pressure. But keep in mind before starting the ranking that I have tested all the rackets in Madrid with different temperatures. So if you try the same racket as me in a much more hotter place, you will feel the racket softer than I do, because heat softens racket and cold hardens them. Alright, perfect Pablo, let's stop with the theory and get to the practical part, because what are those hard rackets? Well, keep in mind one more thing, that I've included one racket per brand and I've ordered them from least to most hard, but obviously all of them are already hard by definition. So let's start with the Adidas Multiweight Control by Alex Reed, the hardest Adidas racket but the softest in this ranking. It uses Adidas hard rubber but it's not as hard as the rest, as we will see later. At the same time, it's the most expensive racket in this ranking at 360 euros with the code 4Set at Padel Market, which also supports me if you use it to keep creating content. It's a racket that has only is designed for 3 seasons because it works, and if something works, why you should change it? Although I like the orange version more. Its weight and balance are customizable with the screws, but I prefer it without adding anything to move it better. But what I like least is the handle, only 11 centimeters, and I feel it's too short. But yes, it has a very good sweet spot that allows you to have a lot of control and a pleasant feel when hitting the ball. But Pablo, is not the metal bone harder than the multi-weight? Well, actually they are very similar, but look at the differences in ball output and in hardness. The multi-weight feels a bit harder even though both use the same rubber. Well, we're moving up in the ranking and now we have the Nox Future Hybrid Denos former racket. Actually, it's a racket made in Nox's own factory in Paraguay and incorporates the brand's hardest rubber, the EV50. It was my favorite racket during the 72 hours I spent training at the Nox Future Academy, and this is going to sound cliché, but it was because of its combination of power and control. To be honest, the hybrid format is my favorite, and in this case, with the materials it has, the combination of hardness, power and control is brutal. But things to improve, in my opinion, is the roughness, because it's practically unnoticeable and the size of the handle is also short. It's still not one of the hardest racket in this ranking, but if you have a soft racket and want to start with a harder racket, this can be a very good transition. Notice the performance of the Future Hybrid in the ball output and hardness test, because as I said, it feels very comfortable when playing. We're moving up in the ranking with the Bull Padel Explo Martin Denos racket. And despite being, according to Bull Padel, the most powerful racket in its history, I didn't get that feeling, partly because of how light it is. The racket comes with the Core already installed, but if you don't like it like me and I remove it, my racket weighs 358 grams, which is very light. And actually I love that lightness because it allows you to move the racket very easily, but you lose power. It's the only racket in the ranking that incorporates a double density rubber, and in Bull Padel case is in a hard, soft, hard format. And this is curious because other brands like Nox or Starby do it the other way around, soft, hard, soft, and that for me makes more sense. But the combination of that rubber with the 12K carbon gives the racket a drier rather than hard feel, but you feel like you have a lot of control in all your shots. With the hole pattern it has and the almost imperceptible rough surface, you notice how with a new ball on the serve or in a volley, the ball can slip. And being such a light racket, if you like to smash but are not a very physical player, it can be very good for you. We have reached the moment of truth because now we're really getting into the rackets that can be categorized as truly hard, and we are starting with the Head Speed Pro. And this racket is the only one in the ranking that mixes carbon fiber and glass fiber, but along with the power foam, they make the hardest head racket. Similarly, in terms of weight and balance, I will say is the most difficult to use in this entire ranking, because it can weigh up to 380 grams with a balance of 27 centimeters, so if you are not a physical player, I don't recommend it. It's also the only racket in this ranking that doesn't have any kind of roughness. But if you look closely, the holes in the upper part of the racket are more spaced out to have more rigidity in the smash and generate more power. There is a motion version the racket Ari Sanchez uses with the same materials but 15 grams less, which is an interesting option to consider. But if we look at the ball output and hardness of the Speed Pro, it has a similar ball output to the previous racket, but is a touch harder. And now we enter the podium of the hard rackets in this ranking. So with the bronze medal, we find the Wilson Blade V3, the racket Javi Garrido used it until recently. And I have to confess that it's the racket I like least in this ranking for a simple reason. It's very difficult to move, even more so than the Speed. It has a weight between 355 and 375 grams and a balance of 27 centimeters. It uses Wilson hardest carbon and hardest rubber, and that's very noticeable in the ball output and the sweet spot. Because trust me, it's a very technical racket, because being so sluggish and having so little ball output, you either hit it perfectly or you're going to suffer. But credit where credit is due, because overhead is a missile. In fact, I would say it's one of the most powerful hybrid rackets of all. And it's also true that it's the prettiest racket in this ranking. But be careful for those with small hands, because the grip is wider than normal and can be uncomfortable. But nevertheless, look at how the ball output and hardness test turned out. Here you can already tell we're talking about a hard and demanding racket. But now for the silver medal in hardness, and in this ranking my favorite racket, the Bablat Juan Lebron. The Viper is a racket that has evolved a lot over time, although it is true that last year's racket was harder than the 2025 one. Notice the difference in ball output and hardness between both models, because the difference is really noticeable, and even though both are hard, that ultimately also led to vibrations that could have affected Juan and his injury. For me, the 2024 one was too hard, but this 2025 one is practically perfect in hardness. But as Juan told me, you have to give it 1 to 2 weeks for it to soften a bit with use, and it will get the perfect feel. And despite being a high balance racket, the thin and long 13 cm grip makes it feel very maneuverable to me. I have it configured the same as LeBron, removing the factory grip and adding 2 other grips, and it feels perfect. at least for me. And on the court, you will notice it's one of the rackets with the less ball output of all, so you either hit the shot well or it will penalize you. But if you do it well, you will put the ball wherever you want because it has a lot of control. Aspects to urgently improve for me are the roughness, because it's too unnoticeable and it's a shame that such a top racket has that defect. But now for the hardest racket in this ranking and also the most powerful of all, the Starbite Triton Pro. It's the racket with the highest balance of all at 28 centimeters, the hardest carbon, and without a doubt the hardest rubber, Starbite's EVA Pro 50. If all Starbite models are generally hard, the Triton Pro is the hardest of all. And as you can imagine, having these characteristics is not a racket suitable for just any player. It's a very demanding racket that has hardly any ball output, so you can suffer, especially in defense. But if you have the right technique and physique, the Triton Pro is a delight for attacking. Both in volleys and in the overhead shots, especially the smash, where the Triton brings out the best in itself. And something I love about the Triton is the grip, because it's 13 centimeters and thin, and it also has a round cap that is my favorite. But yes, the rough surface compared to the Kenta, for example, which is also a Starbite racket, could improve. But well, as you can see in the ranking, there are hard rackets but with completely different approaches. The Triton Pro has nothing to do with Alex Ruiz Multiweight, for example, but all of them are hard rackets. Would you be missing any racket from another brand in the ranking? And remember, you get a 10% discount with the code 4Set at Padel Market, so thank you so much for watching the video and see you in the next one. Ciao!